Africa, the legal company, and friend of the Asasa Breakfast Show. And we say good morning to you, sir.
Good morning to you. My name is David, not Daniel.
David Ofosu-Dorte, thank you very much for joining us on the show, as always. Now, you've written an op-ed proposing various or looking at various aspects of the proposed privatization or private sector involvement in ECG. First of all, your response to the announcement of this 7-member committee inaugurated on the 24th of January. It has just 1 month to deliver its proposals to the government. Do you think that will be adequate time to take into account the wealth of factors that you set out in your op-ed paper and propose workable solutions to the government?
Well, I have not examined the details of the membership of the committee, but I do know the chair of the committee. But if you notice, my op-ed was written after the committee was inaugurated, not before. And it was an intentional op-ed to let us bring issues to the fore without letting it narrow down. And I'm focusing on the public debate of it, without letting it narrow down to an NDC versus an MPP debate. And I made that very clear in the op-ed. So once the op-ed was issued, hopefully that the committee will also avert their minds to it. And I titled it the Hydra-headed issue that the committee and the energy minister face. The intention was more to help the public, as it were, contribute to the debate and contribute to the committee's work in one way or the other. So that's more the focus. As to whether the committee is adequate or not, I have not addressed that issue, but I do believe the minister and the committee chair who have said I know are competent enough to know who on the committee has the ability to shape the intended private sector participation.
The committee intending particularly to look at possibilities of local content involvement in a possible private sector intervention in ECG. Now, the problem with private with the local content, as you set out in your op-ed, being very often that Ghanaian-owned interests that might want to take a stake in ECG. ECG, of course, being a limited liability company, but 100% owned by the government. The problem being that Ghanaian-owned interests are seen either not to have the resources to acquire the scale of acquisition of share interests that they might want to in the company, or not to have the requisite expertise. Looking to how local content is to be negotiated, because the new energy minister has made it very clear that that is going to be one of the matters front and centre of the 7-member committee and the way it looks at private sector involvement. How do you see a local content strategy being devised to engage with the problem?
I think before we come to local content, we should look at what it is that ideally the committee should achieve, or the intended private sector involvement should achieve. First and foremost, I believe the essence of wanting private sector participation is because ECG is supposed to be a highly indebted entity. Just before I came on air, I think I heard some news today about the company even under declaring its turnover, which itself is a very big issue. So the question as to whether it is actually indebted or booking its books is another matter that we need to look at. So I want to focus first, before coming to local content, and what exactly are the problems and why there is the intention of the private sector participation. And as I said in the op-ed, I am not against the private sector participation or for it per se. I think there are technical issues that should be put out there. So the first and foremost question is one of consumer satisfaction. You and I know there are times the lights are off, they are not stable, or at times there are meters, the meters we complain is overrunning or running at a speed, and there are multiple meters, all those kind of complaints, or there is some tree falling on some power line and they are not fixing it on time. So that's one of the problems in terms of customer satisfaction. The other one has to do with the fallback to the independent power producers as to the fact that ECG doesn't, or reportedly doesn't pay them. And that leads to all the power sector debt, which then falls back on the government, and then it becomes public sector debt, and you and I then have to pay more taxes. So that's another issue to look at. The other question to look at then is the local content, which I will come to. And then you have the many of the other issues I raised, particularly to what extent does any privatization or private sector role affect other sectors of the economy. So if I were looking at it, I will first set out all the objectives the committee is to achieve and see to what extent these objectives can be met with a local participation in it. Now, having said that, I think local participation is a good thing, but I do believe that one of the issues I raised is one of the things that they need to look at as to whether the company itself will be disaggregated in terms of the way it is quote unquote privatized. And one of the things I point out is a look at whether the marketing and sales of power to the public should be ring-fenced for the local players as separate from the infrastructure and distribution component. These are basic things that I expect the committee to take a look at. And in that way, you can say you want to specifically deepen local participation in a specified angle. Mm-hmm. Without that, you may be letting the corporation go as a whole. Mm. So I think that's the angle from which I think we can be able to deepen local participation.
So private sector involvement by local players, particularly in the metering or the vending of electricity directly to consumers, hived off from supply and distribution functions of ECG.
I'm not limiting it to that. I'm just saying that if you disaggregate it and then you went incrementally, you can come from one of those angles. Yeah, I think there's an assumption that Ghanaians, even if you want to go private, there's an assumption that Ghanaians don't have the capital or the wherewithal to invest in there. But I think that assumption ought to be re-examined. Probably there is.
Right. Well, that was exactly the question I was asking earlier. Perhaps you might return to it in broader terms later on. But I wanted to ask you from the broader point of view of a company, I think the last financial statements that I was looking at for December 2023 showing a net loss in the region of 10.5 billion cedis. For that year, the year 2023, understandably no dividend being paid to shareholders there. From the outside, looking at the overall picture of where ECG is at, we know it's a utility. We know that this country will always need to keep the lights on, and that ECG is the major electricity supplier and distributor in the country. NEDCO serving the 3 Buna regions and the 5 northern regions, which have a vastly smaller population and much less need on an industrial basis, at least at the moment, for power. So an important player, but with that state of legacy debt and what seems to be an ever-rising mountain of legacy debt, despite measures taken such as ESLA, the energy sector levy recovery measure, the special tax put in to try to minimise that legacy debt. How attractive from the outside do you think this might seem, even to say a multinational player in the market, presumably looking for bang for buck?
I think, again, I call for a rethink of a lot of the assumptions we make. And again, you have pointed out something that relates to that about the debt. But if this morning's news is anything to go by, if a company is under declaring its turnover by as much as 5 billion Ghana cedis, then we cannot be certain whether or not it is actually as indebted as it is. That's the first point.
It is an
second point.
It is an if.
The second point. which we must draw attention to, has to do with the losses that they make. Reportedly, studies show that ECG makes about 25% transmission losses in its distribution. And these have a relationship to do with the losses it makes in its revenue collection. Then there is the revenue collection itself. There was one study I looked at which approximates about 30% of potential revenue sources. If you plug this hole, you may find out that the company is not as bad as it is. The last point in that regard, before I come to your question, is that if the company was such a debt rating company, then certainly, as you put it, investors from outside Ghana will not be interested in it. So my suspicion is that this is a distressed enterprise. If you actually correct those lapses, then it is a cash cow, which is why in my op-ed, I raised the issue as to whether we should be looking at it as a debt rating company or as a potential cash cow. In any distressed company, you first rectify that is where the lapses. Make sure that you bring it back to a break-even point and let it start growing, making money. And it's important that we take a critical look at that, because otherwise we may end up having a private sector participation, which creates recourse to the public purse. And I must say, that is actually my major motivation for writing the op-ed, and trying to move it away from political debate. And give me a minute to explain that. When we changed ECG from a statutory corporation to a company limited by shares, the intention was that merely changing it from a statutory corporation to a company was going to make it profitable. Today, it owes more than it did before it was changed. There is no guarantee that handing it over to the private sector will not lead to a recourse to the public purse. And if we don't address the issues I'm raising, we will have that recourse. So how we structure it to ensure that the private sector does not, for example, cook his books as well, even if it takes over, or as it were, use transfer pricing and other strategies to make sure that the company continues to look bad and pass on its obligations to the public sector, are critical parts that we need to look at. So in my view, government can ring-fence the debt which has accrued, but should structure it in a way as to prevent the private sector from doing that, and also to ensure that the private sector pays dividends to shareholders, which is the government.
Indeed. So looking at, as you said, the overall structure of the company and what you see as two of the primary areas that, if fixed, could potentially turn ECG into a cash cow, the distribution losses to which you refer, presumably those will only be rectifiable with some serious capital investment in the company. Now, looking, as you said, at the curious balance of potential share ownership after some kind of structuring of private sector involvement in the company, to what extent would you expect a private interest looking to take a stake in ECG? To what extent would they expect the government to have done that remedial work on, if you like, the hardcore, the distribution network, the physical infrastructure?
I would be surprised if the government does that remedial work before it hands over to the private sector. Then what will be the purpose if the company? There are two separate things. We have the debt which is accrued, which I expect it to be ring-fenced. I don't expect any private sector entity to be absorbing debt that accrued before it came in.
And for that debt to be written off, or to be for the money.
Again, in the op-ed, I raised a question as to whether the government intends to write it off or to absorb it. I will not prefer an opinion on it at this moment. I would like to see what the government will want to do. But definitely my view is that I don't want it to become additional taxes to me. So ideally, whatever treatment it is, it shouldn't come back to me as a taxpayer. Having said that, in respect of how the government fixes and creates the capital injection, two things are important. One is, what exactly is the size of that capital? I believe the committee and other experts will establish that. The capital may not be as huge as perhaps it is being presented. More importantly, at times you can inject the capital on an incremental basis, in which case it is then possible to have some significant local participation even at the capital injection point. That's the first one. The second one has to do with, to what extent do you ensure that whoever takes over actually fixes that distress. And by injecting capital, because without injecting capital from the private sector, then we are handing over an already, as it were, a company which is breaking even to them. No, we shouldn't be doing that. It is the private sector which must inject that capital, bring the company up. And then, as I say in the op-ed, we must create benchmarks, for example, as to how long it should take a private entity to fix it. Mm-hmm. When does it return to growth? When does it start making money? When does it ensure that it meets the requirements of the wider strategy? And let me illustrate one wider strategy we tend to be overlooking. Definitely, every government over the past 30 years or so have been talking about industrialization. And I have made a point that no country can industrialize if it is selling power to the industries at more than 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you gave it to a private entity, and assuming I was the one who was taking over, I'll be very profit-minded. And if you're already doing sales at about 13 cents, I want to go up and make more margins naturally. How do we ensure that there's a balance in the tariff to ensure that industries, and I'm not talking about industries like a law firm, I'm talking about industries which are manufacturing and have multiplier effect on the economy. What extent do we have discriminatory tariff and give them the tariff that makes them competitive to employ more people, whilst at the same time satisfying the consumer? So these are things that I expect the committee to address. And more importantly, the lines of those of you who have the media space should be asking these questions when these things come up, so that we focus the discussion on the things which don't end up bringing the debt back to us.
At the moment, in terms at least of the sale price to the consumer, the cost being between 12 cents per kilowatt hour and 10 cents, or 10 and 12 cents per kilowatt hour. The lower tariff, I believe, going to the household user. And then the other side of the problem to do with revenue collection, and some of the main guilty parties owing ECG vast sums of money being state institutions, the government of Ghana, or at least agents of the government of Ghana. The Ghana Armed Forces, we know from talking to the immediate past managing director of ECG, Samuel Dubik Mahama, being amongst some of the largest debtors to ECG. Do you, or from if you were a private sector potential investor in the company, is that a problem that you definitely would like to see some progress on before making an investment in ECG?
Well, I can take one of two approaches, either to see some progress on it, but by the way, if the company is in debt, there's a debtor, to the company, let's say as the armed forces or any of those, I don't have these specific debtors. But if I have any such debt and I am taking over the company, I will expect that the payment due will go to government, because I'm not going to be absorbing that debt in the first place, which is why I said that accrued liabilities have to be absorbed and somehow ring-fenced or written off. I don't know how the government will treat that. Having said that, what I would expect the government to do before a private sector party, if any, takes part, is how to ensure that those people to whom I must continue supplying power are up and doing and they are paying. And for that, I raised a few issues. One of them is the nature of metering. I mean, we, all of us, or most of us, have moved to the so-called prepaid meters. Why aren't other government entities moving to prepaid meters? Because ECG has said that several times. And why is it that there are no budgets provided to them? Why should they be owing in the first place? So if we ensure that the prepaid goes to all those places, except critical agencies, then, I mean, we can solve this problem. And I see the armed forces as an example is one critical agency. But I expect that government will then make the budgetary allocation for that. The other issue I raise has to do with whether there will be public service obligation. Public service obligation is simply where, for example, the government says that supply the armed forces or the police or the fire service and do not put this off. And I also raise the issue, for example, as to Ghana water pumping stations. Assuming these are continuously supplied, does the government take over that? And to what extent is a formula put in place by the tariff regulator to ensure that the private sector does not take advantage of it and pass on its inefficiencies to the government through public service obligation? Then I raised the issue also about lifeline consumers. There's a history in this country of every single government at some point, and I hope this current government will not do the same thing, at some point absorbing the tariffs that were supposed to be paid by lifeline consumers. And the PURC has got 3 categories. The lifeline consumers is the one that normally have the lowest amount of consumption, but they are the largest in the population in terms of votes. And anytime it comes to near election year, then the government will say, I have absorbed these tariffs. And these tariffs then end up becoming public sector debt. So these are the things that if a private sector person is operating, they are definitely not going to be absorbing that debt. It will be passed on to the government. There ought to be a formula so that the discriminatory tariff creates what we call in economics cross-subsidization, so that even if that has to be done, it is known in advance. Whatever subsidy, if any government has to do, is known in advance. If you don't talk about all these things, it will look as if private sector has some magic wand, and the moment they come, everything will be kosher. As I pointed out, private sector enterprises at times do fail as well.
I'm sure they do. And as you say, these being very special cases because without our water running, you talk about the potential double whammy of problems with power supply to our water company and the double crisis that you could effectively very easily end up with unless we have a very carefully structured arrangement with any private sector entity looking to involve itself in ECG. So a lot of room for questioning and certainly needing to hedge about to make sure that some of these very practical problems, as well as the invisible problems which are to do with keeping a healthy and well-lit population going and powering of heavy industry. You talk in your op-ed also about the idea of a 24-hour economy and how it's to be powered up, all to be taken into account. Too much to cover all the individual points. The paper well worth reading, published by AB and David, by David Ofosu-Dorte. But I wanted to ask you, in conclusion, Mr. Ofosu-Dorte, what you thought one might learn from previous private sector interventions with ECG. Have we learned any lessons from our previous experience, for example, with negotiating IPP agreements, independent power purchase agreements, or indeed from our experiment with PDS and handing over some level of responsibility for distribution to it in recent past years?
So, I mean, just before the lessons learned, you raised a very important issue that I should comment on. That has to do with the issue of its impact on the 24-hour economy, as it were. And the point I raised in the op-ed is that if my understanding of 24-hour economy is right, then I expect industries which opt to operate a 24-hour economy to have some discriminatory tariff during the off-peak hour. And so that if a private sector entity is operating, then that should be taken into account. But there is a more, as it were, let me say, a more important issue that's also raised in the op-ed that we need to talk about before your main question, which has to do with access to electricity. There's the so-called global development goals. And Ghana, if my information is right, is about 85% of access to electricity. To what extent will a private sector entity be focused on increasing access to electricity? These are things that we need to think about. And on the main question as to lessons learned from attempt to privatize ECG, there are two sources of lessons that we need to learn. One is the PDS, but before coming back to the PDS, Ghana Water was once, quote and unquote, tested in privatization. And in Ghana, we tend to forget lessons so quickly. The Aquavitins Rand, which was a South African company, which took over Ghana Water Company at some point. And there were copious complaints, etc. Some pluses, some minuses. I think after about 5 years, the decision was made. If I recall, at that time, I think Abba Babin was the then Minister for Works and Housing. It was made to actually call off that and return Ghana Water to. But again, from my information from the public, it doesn't seem that much has changed. So we need to learn the lessons from that. And in that approach, it was a management contract, not a takeover.
Right.
And we also separated Ghana water from urban water. So the lessons from that was that probably the management contract wasn't the way to go. I'm not sure whether lessons from Ghana water necessarily apply to ECG. In the ECG case of PDS, I think it was a question of, and again, I raised that in the op-ed, it's a question of not being able to separate what I would call the wheat from the chaff. I think in doing any privatization, it is important to know separate the serious players who have the wherewithal, both technical and financial, from those who are transaction driven. Very often, in such things, you have those who have access to corridors of power and are transaction driven and are just looking for a transaction opportunity without necessarily looking for the long term. There may be Ghanaians who may even be given local participation who will only offload it subsequently to foreigners. These are all issues we need to deal with. And if I can bring the benchmarks, and again, this is not the forum, but at the appropriate forum, some of us can make suggestions as to how these can be achieved. So I'm not just raising issues, there are solutions to them. I do believe that those are the major lessons to learn to ensure that we don't get back into, for want of a better word, another PDS.
Some might say that the service that they got while PDS was running, our power distribution, was considerably better than some of their experience with ECG, taking your point about customer satisfaction right at the top end of our discussion. But some very interesting food for thought there from David Ofosu-Dorte. Great thanks to you, sir, again, for those insights into the pitfalls and also the potential of private sector involvement in our electricity distribution and supply services. Thank you very much for joining us on the Asasa Breakfast Show.
Thank you. You're welcome.
David Ofosu-Dorte there, and yes, the paper is very well worth reading. I hope perhaps we might even be able to put it on our social media here on the Asasa Breakfast Show, so you can get a little snippet of the wealth of ideas and indeed problems as set out in the paper by our guest